Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Danish TV's English language channel, the global voice of Center for Muslim World Studies. And today, we always try to present you with speakers that can enlighten us, enrichen, and deepen our insights into the world today, into the many political, social, economic issues, cultural issues that are confronting us, the multiple cascading crises that are affecting humanity today, and the way that people of faith, people who are interested in justice and peace, the way they can respond to these multiple crises that we confront as the human family. But tonight is incredibly special for me personally. We have a very dear mentor of mine, a dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak, who, without going into too much detail in terms of the biographical introduction, because then that will be the whole show, and this is a very busy man, and I will respect the time constraints on this show. But suffice it to say, I think if people believe me on this one, and you don't have to believe me on many other things, but believe me on this one, the Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak, who we have with us today, perhaps is one of the great moral, prophetic voices of the latter part of the 20th century, in my humble opinion. His the inspirational role that not only he played in the liberation struggle in South Africa against apartheid rule, but beyond that, the powerful message and voice that he has exuded throughout the world, inspiring generations particularly those coming from a faith-affirming background, to struggle for peace and justice, and to recognize the power that faith can actually play in these struggles. Whereas we, of course, people here, our viewers in Pakistan, throughout the other parts of the world, sometimes we have a lot of caricatures of religion, of faith-based individuals involved in certain struggles and so on. And we often see it as a very retrograde or reactionary or backward form of consciousness in Pakistan, or some of our liberal secular friends. And we have a man with us today, I think, that may dispel many of those stereotypes about what actually faith can inspire one to do in the context of enormous injustices and cruelties that are inflicted upon us. So, in terms of an introduction, Dr. Reverend Allan Boesak has just been a leader in the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. He's been the president of that. He's been a part of so many different organizations striving for justice, numerous awards, numerous professorships, desired in all corners of the globe. We got him for a little while today, and that I'm so excited about. I had the good opportunity to be with him in Germany recently, and of course, I would not waste that opportunity to be glued to the man and to absorb as much knowledge, wisdom, and guidance, as we say in Islam, the Hidayah and the Nasiyah, from a man who has such a powerful prophetic voice speaking against injustice. So I'm sorry I'm cutting the introduction a bit short, Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak, but I want to get into the discussion so that
Absolutely.
I don't take too much of your time.
So
welcome. First of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Junaid. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Good evening. It is a great pleasure to be with you and to have this discussion with a young man that I much admire. And I look forward to our conversation tonight. Thank you for having me on.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much. Allan Boesak, we wanted to touch upon, I think, two main topics, and I will let our viewership know that. One is for those of our viewers, especially in Pakistan, who know the name about Nelson Mandela. They certainly know the name Mandela, have the sense that there was a struggle, but not really the nitty-gritty or the details of what exactly was the issue at hand for which this freedom struggle arose in South Africa. And of course, I'm not just picking on my Pakistani sisters and brothers, but our viewership throughout the world. So the first topic that I wanted you to address and give your reflections upon was what that freedom struggle was about, and what motivated you personally. What was your own political, a theological trajectory that compelled you to be involved in that struggle in the way that you were? So if we can begin with that very broad subject.
Well, very broadly speaking, one has to place the apartheid struggle, of course, within the broader framework historically of the struggle of the South African indigenous people against imperialism and colonialism. So let's say roughly from 1652, when the Dutch came and started to colonize South Africa from the Cape northwards. From in that period, so we had, with strict imperialist colonialism, we had about 300 years and another 50 years of apartheid since 1948, up until 1994, when apartheid was officially off the books. It's not gone in reality by any means whatsoever, but it is no longer on the books. It's no longer the policy of the land. But so within those 350 years, you've had almost from the very beginning the indigenous people resisting once they began to understand what the colonizers were doing in terms of land theft, and later on in terms of enslavement and in terms of genocide, all of those things. There was a 170-year period of constant rebellion and resistance from the indigenous peoples that developed into different kinds of wars. And then, of course, when South Africa became a sort of a colony on its own in 1910, 2 years later, the African National Congress was formed. But before that, in 1908, Dr. Abdurrahman here in the Cape already began to bring people together for the sort of first organized, formalized forms of resistance, and an organization that he called the African People's Organization. So from the very beginning, the idea that we are Africans, that we are African people who can come together, that we can overcome those lines of tribalism and ethnicity and culture and so forth that the colonizers had tried to use to divide us so much and to make us stand one against the other, that can be overcome. So by the time the ANC was formed, we already had an idea that a national movement of the oppressed people of South Africa against colonialism and racism and white supremacy is possible. And that developed, of course, into different forms. So by the time apartheid became the official policy of the country in 1948, not very long thereafter, the African National Congress had decided that their old way of fighting the struggle, and I mean the kind of gentleman politics.
And Dr. Boesak, if I may just stop you, just a working definition of apartheid itself. What was a working definition of apartheid?
Apartheid was a system that was based on white supremacy and racism, white superiority, And of course, on the other hand, the inferiority of black people. That's the one thing.
Right.
Politically, economically, socially, apartheid was worked out in a system that scientifically was probably the most comprehensive structure of racist oppression and capitalist exploitation in the 20th century in terms of systems. And that has been thought out very, very carefully. So from every science, every way of life, apartheid brought the best white intellectuals together to work that out scientifically.
Yes.
And then, of course, they got political power in 1948 to work that out practically in politics and policies.
Right.
That apartheid had a number of pillars, and I will just mention, of course, violence in all its forms. So physical violence, military, the police, psychological violence, socio-economic violence through exploitation, and so forth. That was a pillar. But the other pillar that it could not do without, because this was such a peculiar arrangement for South African religious white people, especially the Afrikaners, was that they developed a moral and theological and biblical justification for this practice and policy of apartheid. And you must understand, the one could not do without the other. If you took away the moral justification for which they claimed biblical justification, for which they claimed that they, the white Afrikaners, were God's chosen people, and that God had sent them to this darkest corner of dark Africa to come and claim the land for themselves. So the land was God's gift to them. The people of the land was intended by God to be their slaves and their underlings and work for them, but could never, of course, be their equals. So if you understand how important religion was for the oppressor, then you will understand that if you took away the moral and theological and biblical justification of their philosophy and their practices, the other pillar that would only leave them with economic exploitation, naked political power, and violence was never going to be enough. And there were people, very, very strong frontmen of apartheid. Was one who was a politician, but also a minister in the White Dutch Reformed Church, who was the main developer of this theology of apartheid, Dr. Andries Treurnig. And he said, everybody must understand very clearly, if the Afrikaner could at any point be convinced that apartheid was immoral, that it was unchristian, that it was not God's will for South Africa and all South Africa's people, then he said every single Christian Afrikaner would be obligated to turn his back and her back on the policy and fight against it. That's how important this was. And keep that in mind when we come to talk later about the role of faith in the resistance against all of this. And so when apartheid became the policy of the country, I was 2 years old, and so I saw the practicalities of this policy unfold, not just in our communities, in the broader sense, through the Bantustans, through the educational system, through the inferiority that was implanted and imprinted upon Black people at every level, at every opportunity, but also, of course, in one's own family. I mean, I could only look at what it was doing to my mother to begin to understand that this is an evil system. Yes. And so for me, Junaid, as a child growing up, and I grew up in a very strong religious family. My father, who unfortunately died when I was very young, I was only 6 years old, and he was only 43, left my mother with 8 of us. But she, in turn, was a woman of amazing faith and kept her family and the children together in ways that even now, looking back after so many, I don't even begin to understand how she did it.
Right.
Anyway, so my faith comes out of that kind of background. And so for me, very early on, when I was a teenager, the question, if this is what I see around me,
yes,
this incessant, indescribable evil system, what it is doing to people, if this is Christian, if this is God's will, if this is what the Bible tells not only them to do, but tells me to do, and so whereas the Bible told them, this is
right,
your land, this is your God, you can rule over these people, and the Bible then was supposed to tell me what you must do in order to be obedient to God, in order to please God, is be obedient to these people and
right,
to accept the situation as God's will. And so very young, those questions came up. Is this true? Can this be the God that I'm supposed to serve? Is this the God of the Bible? And if this is true, what am I doing with this faith? Now,
right.
can I leave Christianity and go somewhere else? Can I just leave Christianity and no longer believe in anything? But my parents, and especially my mother, had a way of praying, and she didn't even finish primary school properly.
Right.
But her way of talking about God, almost an intuitive instruction that she was giving to her children, because she always talked about God as the God of the poor, the defender of the widow. And I mean, she meant herself, of course, the defender of the widow and the orphan, the savior of the stranger, and so forth and so. And that was straight from the Psalms in the Bible. So
absolutely,
that idea,
and straight from Islam, and straight from the Quran.
exactly,
Yes, absolutely,
exactly. So that idea, I always say to people, my first informal instruction on liberation theology came from my mother. So when I started battling with this, and I made the decision, no, I really want to be a Christian, but I cannot be the kind of Christian these people are, and the kind of Christian these people expect me to be. So my struggle was, can I discover a different kind of Christianity, a different kind of faith, a different way of reading and interpreting and understanding the Bible? And so from a very young age, and for the rest of my life, I would meet people and see people and talk to people and see what it means to really stand in the struggle and not give up your faith. And of course, one of our sterling icons of the struggle, a man by the name of Albert Luthuli, who was the president of the African National Congress in the late 1940s into the 1950s, and was the leader of that amazing movement in the 1950s of nonviolent civil disobedience resistance against apartheid that we call the Defiance Campaign. Albert Luthuli did that. And Albert Luthuli said, what I want to do is I want to take my Christianity with me into the struggle and hope that it can contribute to the character of the resistance. And I always thought, you don't go, as a person of faith, you don't go into the struggle to baptize the struggle, to make proselytes of everybody. Say, if you don't become a Christian, you can't work with me, and I won't work with you. Because the struggle was already on when we were born, and the churches came to the struggle fairly late. But a person like Albert Luthuli taught us as the younger generation then to say, no, you don't throw your faith away. You don't have to throw your faith away. You go and you tackle this monster, and you do it as a person of faith. And you will then begin to understand, as you enter the struggle and you face the challenges of the struggle, will my faith mean anything for me in those decisive moments? And I have discovered, yes, it does.
And you mentioned the term, what in some ways you argued that your first introduction to liberation theology came from your mother, and the experience of her raising you, and the kind of the emphases that she put on certain values of the faith tradition. I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, about how you became a liberation theologian. What is liberation theology? And throughout your struggle, particularly in the 1980s, what was the kind of the context of that liberation theology mobilizing large numbers of South Africans as part of the
Yes.
broader United
Yeah.
Democratic Front
Right.
movement against apartheid?
Right. So liberation theology is a theology that believes that the central and most enduring message of the Bible is one of liberation, of freedom, of justice, of dignity, of solidarity, of engagement in struggles for justice on behalf of others. And so we read the Bible and we discern in the Bible that there is always a struggle between two schools of thought. You can almost say two traditions is even better. The one tradition is a tradition that comes from the rich and the powerful within ancient Israel and within the Old and New Testament, where those who are in powerful, privileged, wealthy positions with status seek to find and put God on their side and try to make as if God is the God of their favor, and they are God's favorites, whereas there is the other tradition that stands up against that. Says, no. The first time the Bible really speaks of God is when God steps in, intervenes to free an enslaved people. God is a God of justice. First and foremost, before you say anything about that God is a God of justice. And so that tradition that comes out in the prophets, and for me, the prophetic tradition does not begin with Elijah and Elisha and with Jeremiah and Isaiah, although they are in that tradition. For me, in the Bible, the prophetic tradition of resistance against oppression and against the Pharaoh begins with two women in the birthing chamber in the book of Exodus, where Pharaoh says to the women, "You got to kill these Hebrew babies," and the women say, "No, we won't do it." That is resistance, and that's where it begins. And who follows them? Moses' mother. And who follows Moses' mother? Her daughter by the name of Miriam. That's why my last book that I wrote was to plea for Black theology to embrace the Miriamic tradition. The women have so much to teach us if we will only open our eyes and our ears and be taught by them. So those two traditions, and for me, those are the traditions, the prophetic tradition of hopeful resistance comes through in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so Black theology embraces that. Black theology also believes that if you talk about theology and about faith, you begin with the reality, the lived experience of the people. It is the misery and the suffering and the oppression of the people that you see first, and then you ask, what does God say about that? And I say this because here is another woman coming. When I was ordained in 1968 in my congregation in a beautiful place here in the Western Cape, it was
just for our context. Dr. Boesak, ordained.
Ordained means. I'm so sorry, man. Ordained means that you finish your theological study at the theological seminary, much like you guys do.
Yes.
And then we have a system in our church where a congregation must call you. So the congregation comes together. They have names on a list. Some people may know you, and they say, we want this person to be our pastor. And then they issue a formal call. You respond to that call. And then the moment you come to that congregation for the first time, there's a huge service, and there's celebration, and there's singing, and there's all sorts of things. And then you are officially ordained. They lay their hands upon you, and they make you the pastor of that church. And they also then make you enter the ministry of the church. It's always a wonderful moment. So that happened to me on the 24th of February 1968, one day after my 22nd birthday. So, which at that point was the youngest minister in our church, but that's beside the issue. Yeah.
Wow.
So at that time, the apartheid government had issued in 1950 a law called the Group Areas Act, through which the government arbitrarily declared parts of cities or towns or whole towns, they declared white. And everybody who wasn't white was to be forcibly removed and dumped in places where they will now live in their designated so-called colored areas. It was a devastatingly cruel law, and it destroyed communities. And I don't believe that those communities and the people will ever recover from the trauma and the damage that was done. I mean, imagine here in Cape Town was a community that we call the District 6.
Yes.
It was a vibrant community with different racial groups and different religious groups, Christians and Muslims and Jews living together. They had developed a culture that was so quintessentially and uniquely of Cape Town. I mean, they had sounds of their own. They had almost a language of their own, a way of expressing themselves. It was a beautiful, wonderful thing. And that community was totally destroyed. And the people scattered all across the Cape Flats today in places where they never thought they would end up. And you know, you walk through these new colored townships, so-called today, and you would find people's name, or the names of their homes, reflecting the streets where they lived in District 6. They are desperately trying to cling to that, but the culture is gone, my brother. The sense of community is gone. The non-racialism is gone. So my congregation was struck with that thing. And so when I got there, in the first week or two, I went around introducing myself, and I came to a house. And there was an older woman and her husband, but the woman was the one who did the talking. Aunt Marai, we called her. And so she invited me in. And she said to me, Reverend, please sit down. And then she said, she wasn't one for small talk. She said, you don't have to tell me anything about Jesus because I've known him much longer than you. So that's done. Over. Goodbye. Then she said, but what I do want you to talk to me about is what is happening here, about this injustice. And she then says, look what they are doing, Reverend, she says. They're taking our lands, they're stealing our land, they're stealing our homes, they are destroying our communities. She says, they're stealing my memories. And I want you to tell me what God thinks about that. And Sunday morning, she says, you go on that pulpit, and I want you to preach on this thing.
Yes.
Well, I mean, Junaid, I found out a number of things, which the most important thing is I found out the total inadequacy of my theological training, which I received from these white Dutch Reformed Church missionaries who were sent to our seminary by the white church, because we were so subservient and totally subjected and dependent upon them. So that was a theology that was meant to serve apartheid and to colonize my mind so that I become a black servant of apartheid. And so it did not prepare me at all for the questions of justice and the reality of injustice and oppression that they themselves profited, of course, from so handsomely.
Yes.
And Anne-Marie made me understand what is on the mind of the people when they think about the church. She said, you must preach about it. She didn't ask me then, go and lead a demonstration. That would only come much later against the police and against apartheid. She said, preach to me. She was looking for a word of comfort, for a word of protest, for a word of resistance from me as her preacher. She wanted to know, what does God really think of these white people who call themselves Christians, and this is what they do? I couldn't do that properly. And that is what made me understand I need to know more about the Bible, about theology, than these white professors were willing or able to teach me. That's where I tried my very, very best to get out of the country, which I finally succeeded in, and to go and study in the Netherlands to get my doctor's degree. But so for me, and when I came back from the Netherlands, it was 2 weeks after Soweto blew up in 1976. A week later, the students at the University of the Western Cape here in Cape Town invited me to come and speak to them about Black consciousness and what Soweto means for us in the Western Cape. And that, as they say,
Soweto, Dr. Boesak,
Soweto was on June 16, 1976. The students of Soweto, first let me just say, the apartheid government, of course, had separate educational systems for us. Bantu education was the lowest form for Black people. And then they had colored education, a little better than Bantu education, but still abysmally terrible. And then they had education for Indians. And then they had, of course, at the very, very top, and a long distance away from the rest of us, white education. And white education got all of the resources and all of the financial support and all of the best. White education in South Africa, in fact, was one of the best education systems in the world in those days. Because they understood, if you want oppression to work, if you want exploitation to be perfect, if you want the subjugation of the people to be scientifically in place, you cannot only depend on the gun. So you train the ruling classes to be the ruling classes. And that's why you give them the best education. And in the same way, you train the underclasses to be the underclasses and to make them accept, both in their life and intellectually and psychologically, that their lowly status is what they were meant to be. So
if you can control the mind, you don't need the big stick all the time.
That is why. That is why Stephen Biko, who became the father of Black consciousness in South Africa, and an icon of our struggle, an amazing young man who was murdered by the police on 12 September 1977. Steve Biko had a saying that we still use today. He says, remember, the best ally of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So we always remembered that. And that was what the students were beginning to understand. And so they began to rebel, not just against Bantu education, but they began to rebel against apartheid as a system, because they were not stupid. They could see what was happening to their parents. They could see where they lived. They could see, and they felt the dissatisfaction with the quality of their education and with their lives. And so they decided, after almost a decade of suppression of black political activity, after the Sharpeville massacre on March 21 in 1960, when the police rounded up demonstrators who were peacefully demonstrating against apartheid and the past laws, and came with live ammunition, shot and killed 69 people, and wounded 187 of them.
Yes.
Now, after that, the leaders were put in jail. Nelson Mandela was sent to Robben Island. People went into exile. There was almost nothing happening.
But by the way, Dr. Boesak, the widespread notion is that Nelson Mandela went to jail for his Gandhian non-violent approach to the liberation struggle. Can you please set the record straight why Nelson Mandela went to jail?
Nelson Mandela went to jail because he planted bombs. And let me put that in context. After Sharpeville, and after the police reacted and the government so brutally against the Defiance campaign, which was a non-violent form of resistance. I mean, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the streets just about every day, strikes just about every day, and that scared the government to death. And so their reaction was brutal. And out of that came the treason trial and then the Rivonia trial and so forth. So in December, that happened in March, in December of 1960, the African National Congress made a decision that they would now form for the first time an armed resistance wing called Umkhonto weSizwe. So Nelson Mandela was one of the leaders of MK, as we call it. Albert Luthuli was one of the leaders who said, I cannot go along with violent resistance. I understand it. I know that we have knocked upon this door for 50 years and that nonviolence seems as if it doesn't work, but I continue to believe in nonviolence. And so logically speaking, the Gandhian nonviolence line in South Africa runs not through Nelson Mandela, but through Albert Luthuli, and then later through the people of the United Democratic Front. And sort of then bound us to Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in the United States. But Nelson Mandela, when he was finally caught, had a very scientific, cool, almost detached explanation of how the black people were so patient over so many years, had taken so much, and that a moment, he says, must come. You must decide, either we submit or we fight. And for him, fight was taking up the gun. For Albert Luthuli, fight meant militant, nonviolent resistance. And that was the split in the philosophy of the movement. That exists still today, one should say.
But incredible about the complete whitewashing of this history and the position and what Nelson Mandela was perceived as, and then why, we'll get to that in a second, the Palestinians, the Kashmiris, why do they take up the gun? Why can't they be like a Mandela?
But Nelson Mandela became nonviolent towards the end of his prison term, when there were already negotiations going on with the white regime and the white elite in South Africa. And then Nelson Mandela came out and pleaded with the people to lay down whatever guns we may still have. We're not going to fight anymore. He never renounced violence, though. He refused to do that because in his view, it was a very legitimate form of resistance against a government that refused to even listen to any form of nonviolent protest. It's an intransigence of the white regime that made us pick up the gun. And I will never ask you to excuse me for that, he said. So, okay. But Dr.
Boesak, there's a reason why I come to this, not to demonstrate Mandela's proclivity towards armed struggle or anything like that. It's just because of the dominant hegemonic propaganda system today that says that, well, that juxtaposes all of these so-called violent Muslim movements, whether in Kashmir, Palestine, so on and so forth, and juxtaposes it with the great Mandela, and individually, just saying that Mandela, this very peaceful man who led this very peaceful resistance against apartheid. So this is why I emphasize that for our viewership, who are constantly subjected to this propaganda.
Oh, I understand that. I mean, I've written about this in maybe twice in some of my publications, and I had in one book I have a chapter on what I call deification and demonization, and I talk about the deification of Nelson Mandela. And I say that in the eyes of the Western world and the Western media, they took Mandela and they took him on their side and they did something to him, molded him in their own image. And the Mandela that they sent back to us was not the Mandela that the people recognized in their leader. It was a totally sanitized, whitewashed Mandela, speaking only peace and love to white people and not demanding justice for his own people, because those two things always went together. The more Nelson Mandela became acceptable to the Western political Washington consensus establishment, the less Nelson Mandela stood up for the justice that our people deserve in the end. Also, that's a long and complicated story, but it needs to be said.
Right. Absolutely. Professor Boesak, what I wanted to move to, and I know that there's so much more to be said in terms of, and of course, I know that you're too humble to speak about this, but of course, again, reminding our viewership the very pivotal, central role that the Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak played in mobilizing literally millions of South Africans to get involved in the struggle, who were angry at the injustice and cruelties, but to be actively resistant to it. And so it's an incredible role that you played, and I hope we get you on again. And that's where I would really like to kind of pick your brain about
let me just say for 1 minute. I won't. But let me say for 1 minute. The United Democratic Front, which I called for in 1983, became the largest non-violent, non-racial movement, resistance movement in the history of the struggle. And one of the amazing things about the United Democratic Front is how it transcended all these barriers of race and color and culture and religion. I mean, one of my most memorable moments is when we organized a march here in Cape Town to one of the black townships where the police had killed 3 black young boys and would not allow anybody else to come in to be with the family at the funeral. And we decided to march. And who was leading the march? I walked in front with my Bible in my hand, and next to me was Imam Hassan Solomons. From Cape Town, with the Quran in his hand. And when we came to the bridge, and we were confronted by the police with their armored vehicles and their dogs and their guns, the only thing missing that day was the helicopters. He looked at me, and we knew exactly, and we both fell down on our knees, and the crowd behind us did the same. And they arrested us while we were praying. We spent the rest of that day in prison, all of us together. Now, there was a Jewish young woman as well. And I'm not going to make the story too long, but just to say, by the end of the day, we were all fairly hungry because we haven't eaten since the morning. And the young woman had a chocolate bar with her, and there was a young minister who had brought a sandwich. And they gave, it's amazing. Farid Essek was also with us that day.
Right.
They gave the sandwich and the chocolate bar to me and to Imam Hassan. And they said, why don't you share this for all of us? So there we were, having talked about one question: what is it in your faith that brought you to this place today? And the second thing is, what can we share with one another on our hopes for the future? And we took the sandwich, broke it up in pieces, and the chocolate bar, broke it up in pieces, sent it down. For me as a Christian, that was almost like having Holy Communion that day after. I mean, we were praying, and we heard Jewish prayers, we had the Muslim prayer, we had Christian prayers. It was, for me, one of those solidly unforgettable, life-changing moments. And so the character of the struggle in South Africa as a struggle of people of faith, all faiths, became one of the most salient things that gave our struggle such a unique way of doing things, of opening up, of listening to people, and the impact that we had on the country and the world, I still think is amazing. Sorry, but I just had to say that.
That incredibly powerful story, and I'm so glad you said it. It's an incredibly powerful and inspiring story that incident was. And so, Professor Boesak, I did want to move because it's very much related to what went on during that period in South African history, the apartheid struggle, and what we are seeing in what we have been seeing ongoing, the colonization, the settler colonialism, and the apartheid situation in Palestine today.
Yes.
And I bring this issue specifically with you because you have been very vocal on this question of what's going on in Palestine. You have recognized, amongst other South Africans, that how can we, who have participated in our own liberation struggle against this a form of a state that is completely unjust, built on apartheid and separation and segregation, and not say anything about this clear example in front of us. And so I want to finish on this, that what has been your reflections, perhaps if you have visited or you have spoken to Palestinians, what have been your reflections about, in some ways, comparing what is going on in Palestine today and what the Israelis are doing to what the apartheid situation was in South Africa?
Well, thank you for that. I was privileged to visit Palestine once, and I was told that I will not be allowed back again because I came back and told people what I saw and what we experienced as a group.
I'm in good company because I had the same experience.
Well, Junaid, to call Israel an apartheid state is absolutely correct. There's no exaggeration in that, except that since I've been there, I keep on saying to people, apartheid was an evil system, but Black people did not go through under apartheid what Palestinians today have to suffer under by the Israelis. We did not have the evils of that occupation. We did not have the incessant war. I mean, I'm not talking about a psychological war that we had. I'm not talking about war on the poor that we had, and they have also. I'm talking about guns and snipers and planes and we didn't have. We had Bantustans, but we didn't have a Gaza. I mean, the whites were evil, but they were not so intent on genocide in the many ways that the Israelis, to me, are with the Palestinians. And whilst we can point to things that happen, I mean, I buried children that were shot by the police. But I don't know whether we had that on the almost daily basis, where a sniper would sit and aim at somebody in a wheelchair, like we saw, that kind of thing. So in all of those things, there are comparisons, but I think the Palestinians have a much more difficult time than Black South Africans. But apart from that, the main reason also why I think that is that in our struggle, not so much in the beginning, after 1960 and Sharpeville massacre a little bit, and in the United Democratic Front work in the 1980s, it really became a reality. I'm talking about international understanding and solidarity and acts of solidarity.
Right.
So when we began to talk internationally about sanctions and boycott and divestment as a non-violent method of struggle, where you can be very effective without killing anybody with any bomb, there was much more understanding and good reaction from the international community. By the end of 1985, we had even the United States, after Senator Kennedy came to visit South Africa, and he became the driving force of the anti-apartheid sanctions legislation in the United States.
Challenging Reagan's constructive engagement.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was in the U.S. just about maybe once or twice a month in those days. When Senate passed the legislation they received from the House, and Ronald Reagan vetoed it.
Yes.
We went back and forth, and a partisan group of people in the Senate overturned. I mean, Republicans and Democrats overturned Reagan's veto to make the sanctions legislation happen. And it was the first time, they told me, ever in the history of the United States that a veto of a president on a foreign policy matter was overturned by the Senate. That's what we got. I mean, I went around and I had all these college students. Desmond Tutu went around every single university. It was amazing the kind of support our sanctions and boycott movement got. It's exactly the opposite for the Palestinians. There are pockets of hopeful solidarity in the United States, and it's wonderful to see.
Right, and which has been quite recent. I mean, the increase of kind of the BDS campaign, boycott, divestment, sanctions, etc. Very positive, incredibly positive development, very powerful.
Right.
But this has been very recent.
Very recent, but I mean, and in Europe it's even worse. And don't let me talk about what is happening in Europe. I mean, here you have our German friends who are seeking to assuage their guilt for what the Nazis did to the Jews by allowing the Jews to do the same and worse to the Palestinians. How do you ever wash your hands clean from your guilt if you have to wash your hands in the blood of innocent children? Is my question to them. Now, they don't want to hear that question, and they get angry at me when I raise that question. Yes. But that's the question we need to discuss. And I've always said, in the 1980s, I argued that if you want to test the political integrity and the human authenticity of somebody's politics and somebody's humanity, you got to test how they feel and how they react to the apartheid situation. Today is my argument. Today, it is the Palestinians that inform us with that question. How you react to the Palestinian situation will determine the quality of your political, personal, and human integrity and authenticity. And that's how I know whether this person is a person who will stand for the politics of decency and honesty and integrity and humanity. or whether that's a person that will stand for the politics of thuggery and vanity and nationalism, ethnicism, and violence.
Right, and as we know that there are certainly forces in the region that that are certainly on the wrong side on this equation. But I think you put it very well, that that is the litmus test in some ways today. The apartheid situation and the suffering and the cruelties. I mean, Gaza is just abysmal. But even in the West Bank, the ongoing settler colonialism taking place and the Bantustans being created and so on. I think that that is an incredibly powerful note that you left it on, that it is, Palestine has become that symbol of that ongoing prophetic struggle to affirm the dignity and the justice of a people's still suffering the cruelty of colonialism. So, with that, Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak, I know I've taken much more time than I said to you, and I profusely apologize for that.
No.
But it is a pure delight, as you know, to be with you, even virtually, and to just get these pearls of wisdom from you each and every time I get a chance to be with you. So thank you, Reverend Boesak, for being with us today.
It was such a great pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And a warm good night to everybody over there. Thank you.
Thank you, and take care.
All
Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you. You too. Thanks. Bye.